I'm going to be joined here by Paul Joseph Watson, who is one of our writers here as well as a reporter. And he's an expert on what's going on in Europe with the IMF, with the EU, and with the Ukraine. And so Paul has published many stories about this as it's developing, talking about how the bankers are trying to get the Ukraine under their control. We also see how the U.S. is trying to increase tension between Russia and America. And, of course, that serves the interest of the military-industrial complex as well, doesn't it? They were searching around for a mission once the Soviet Union fell apart and they didn't have a credible enemy anymore. So now they're creating credible enemies everywhere, just like they've done since World War II. So joining us now is Paul Joseph Watson. Paul, how you doing?
Hi, David. Good to be back.
Great to have you. Now, you want to talk about the IMF, and they're jumping into the water here, offering all kinds of money to the Ukraine people. Just come on in and sign on the bottom line, right? It's like a kid that just graduated from college getting all these credit card offers, right?
It's amazing, David. The situation right now is we've seen the faux revolution stirred up by the West, by the NGOs, by the United States, by Britain. Now we're seeing the counter-revolution, which is being stirred up by Russia and which is centered in the Crimea, the area of Ukraine to the south where Russia has a naval base. So we've basically got a massive arms build-up with Russia preparing fighter jets on combat alert. They've put out statements saying they've got 150,000 troops ready for a drill. Ukraine is warning against that military build-up, as is the United States. We've got deployment of a U.S. aircraft carrier, which was planned in advance, but some are saying it's related to the building tension. And then we've got the fact, and this is the key to this entire story, on Infowars.com, central banker appointed as Prime Minister of Ukraine. 3 weeks ago, the top U.S. State Department diplomat in Europe, Victoria Nuland, was involved in a leaked phone conversation with another top U.S. diplomat, and they were basically plotting the overthrow of the democratically elected Ukrainian government. And the very person that Nuland named in that leaked phone conversation that they would choose to become the new prime minister of the Ukraine, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, is now the new head of the Ukraine. So the very person they named 3 weeks in advance is now in power, proving once again that this was an act of regime change.
Oh, yeah. And it was even more than that, Paul. You know, I had Steve Pachinik on the Nightly News, and I talked to him about that phone conversation that supposedly was just amazing tradecraft, and the American administration said, I just can't believe that the Russians would listen to our phones like that. And Steve Pachinik said, that was the phoniest thing you've ever heard of. The fact that they would do this on an open line, they wanted the Russians to know this. They wanted the world to know this. It was an in-your-face demonstration. It was provocative. It was trying to, it is basically just hubris, but it's also very provocative. They're trying to provoke tension between the U.S. and Russia, not just pull the Ukraine out of Russia's sphere, but the Crimea is vitally important to Russia because that's their access to water, to the Black Sea.
Well, it would be like Russia stirring up a revolution in Canada or Mexico. Mm-hmm. Or even you could think about it, if Scotland gained independence, it would be like Russia stirring up a revolution in Scotland, targeting England. It's that sensitive because the Ukraine is fundamentally linked to Russia historically. It's been part of Russia for the majority of the past 100 years, of course. And as you said, this leaked phone conversation, the media treatment of it was the fact that Nuland said, F the EU. And that's what all the headlines became about. Oh my God, she's saying F the EU. That wasn't the story. The story was they were picking by name the future leaders of Ukraine in the overthrow, the coup d'etat that they were planning. And now we see that that's come to pass, even though Russia started this counter-revolution against it as part of the new Cold War that is emerging, the NATO encirclement of Russia. Now that that's come to pass in its first stage, the IMF is circling the wagons. Its vultures are preparing to swoop on Ukraine to asset strip the country as part of their tried and tested IMF riot plan, as Greg Palast exposed back in 2001. And today the Associated Press reports that the IMF is sending officials to the Ukraine to start discussing with the Ukrainian authorities which policy reforms would be required in exchange for an emergency loan program. So in other words, again, just as they did in Greece, this is about turning Ukraine into the IMF, the globalist debt slave, by creating the loan shark environment where they have to sell off infrastructure. They have to impose draconian austerity measures, high taxes on their population, as happened in Greece, and install technocrats in the government who basically serve as puppets to the IMF, to the globalists.
Absolutely. You know, Bloomberg reports that they're offering them a $35 billion deal. And of course, that's much better than what the Russians were giving them. The Russians were only giving them $15 billion that they've halted. So they're going to get them totally in debt. Like you just mentioned, they're going to raise their taxes. They're going to control their country, and they may wind up with a situation. You know, one of the previous premiers in the Ukraine was formerly a central banker in the Ukraine. So he was the one who was on the other side from Yanukovych and or Yanukovych. I don't know if I've got the emphasis on the right syllable there, but I always get confused about the Russian names. But he was a central banker, the guy for the opposing party, but he was a Ukraine central banker. These are the guys who've already spent, what is it, Paul, $5 billion to start this revolution there?
Yeah, I mean, Newland announced back in December, around the same time that John McCain went to Ukraine and was buddy-buddy with all these Nazis that are part of the opposition movement. Newland announced that the US had already invested $5 billion in the protest movement in Ukraine. So again, that shows you they were prepared for this. The initial protest started, of course, back in November when Ukraine rejected the EU trade deal and went with Russia. But before that, they knew that this was coming because research shows, and this is linked in my article, that these democratic uprisings, whatever you want to call them, whether they're grassroots or not, whether they're grassroots to begin with and then hijacked by Western powers at a later date, they're entirely predictable because they're linked to the rise in food prices. You can track where unrest is going to happen in countries around the world based on if food prices rise above a certain level, which is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's food price index. Whenever that index rises above 210, the unrest quickly follows in all these different countries. You can track it from Syria, Tunisia, of course, with the Arab Spring, and most recently, Thailand, Venezuela, and you guessed it, Ukraine. So they know ahead of time when these uprisings are really going to pick up steam. So even if you believe, which of course a lot of these Euromaidan protesters are dupes, they're useful idiots, even if you believe that it's an organic uprising to begin with, these democratic revolutions, as they call them, are seen years in advance by the US State Department, which is why the State Department knew as far back as 2008 that the Arab Spring was coming, which is why they had some of their top operators with these NGOs, also linked to the CFR, like Larry Diamond, actually training the Arab Spring leaders on how to effectively use Twitter and Facebook to stir up these revolutions. And as I documented in my expose of the I Am a Ukrainian PR stunt, the very same individual, Larry Diamond, CFR member linked to the State Department, has done extensive work for the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. He was the one behind this viral video, which was basically glib propaganda trying to portray the uprising in Ukraine as exactly that, just a grassroots democratic uprising, when in fact he was the one years ago training Arab Spring activists on behalf of the US State Department on how to foment faux revolutions. And in fact, they did it in the very same hotel that we visited last year for Bilderberg, because we spoke to the hotel staff, the manager, and he said, yeah, we had all these guys here back in 2008 talking about the Arab Spring 3 years before it happened. Yeah. So they know when these riots are coming. They have people prepared to train the leaders. And of course, Soros's Open Society Institute is involved in that as well on the ground with the actual protesters. So they know how to manage these controlled uprisings, even if they're grassroots to begin with.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned that they see this as a leading indicator of the price of food, because we just see in the news today that cattle futures in the U.S. have hit a record level. And we see that there's a real war on independent farms here in America. We've got some articles about that we've been covering on the nightly news the last week or so. They're coming after farmers in just so many different levels. And it reminds me of what happened in the Ukraine. You know, Stalin's approached the Ukraine, and one of the gripes that the Ukrainian people have that is a legitimate gripe is they remember the Holodomor, the starvation that was propagated against the Ukrainian people under Stalin. We see, however, some of these same tactics that are going to be used here in America, where you've got the government coming in and shutting down farms over nonsense reasons. They're now telling organic farmers that they can't use manure or have animals plow their fields. I mean, this has been going on for millennia that this has happened, but now you're going to have to buy commercial fertilizer, that sort of thing. But we see the prices going on here. We see the preparation in America that is our government giving military vehicles to police departments, buying billions of rounds of hollow point ammunition, not target rounds. As you pointed out, you were the spearheading that research, Paul. It's very worrying to see these kind of leading indicators coming here. But besides just the Ukrainian people getting out of the control of one gang of thugs and under the control of these bankers in Europe, these central bankers, Goldman Sachs and others, the other aspect of this is the military buildup. You had an article today about Russia puts fighter jets on combat alert as tensions mount. I mean, the Crimea is vitally important to the Russians from a strategic standpoint, just as Ukraine is from a food standpoint.
Precisely, and that's the biggest danger, isn't it? And now a lot of top analysts are saying this is the start of a new Cold War.
Yes.
You could see it coming beforehand, because Russia and China have been engaged in some of the biggest military buildups and aggressive military rhetoric for the past decade or so. I mean, I've written several articles over the past few months. China conducting attacks on mock US aircraft carriers. They're putting out editorials in state media talking about how the president of China is preparing the PLA for a new giant war. And then you had the display for the recent Land Rover program in China, where the backdrop for the image was a picture of a mushroom cloud over Europe. And it was just an accident. But continued state media editorials in Chinese media talking about targeting the US militarily. China, of course, just got its first actual aircraft carrier. They're talking about building more of those. So it's Iran, Russia and China lined up against the United States. It is a new Cold War. And the fact that neoliberals and neoconservatives are willing to foster that by antagonizing Russia, by fostering this revolution right on its border, just shows how insanely diabolical their plans are, and the fact that they have no genuine concern about the future of the world, because they're creating a situation which could go hot very, very soon. Now we've got analysts, even BBC analysts, talking about a, quote, hot war in Ukraine. So,
well, the war is the lifeblood of the war is lifeblood of the state, isn't it? And you've got both the American government as well as the Chinese government as well as the Russian government. They all can make themselves more important in everybody's lives if they create fear about an outbreak of war. But again, you see in this buildup here in the Ukraine, if that fosters another Cold War, if that fosters another military buildup with a military-industrial complex, who benefits from that? Well, of course, the same bankers that are trying to get control of the Ukraine, isn't it?
Well, precisely. And it also distracts from domestic unrest in America, because as you were talking about before, again, the food price issue in America, once that builds, once people's wallets begin to be hit more and more, there is a potential for unrest. I mean, I did the article yesterday. Pat Cadell, former presidential advisor and pollster, basically said that the soft oppression that Americans are currently experiencing could lead to a Kiev-style uprising in the United States. And then, of course, you have the U.S. Army building fake towns, $96 million worth, with churches, municipal buildings, underground subways, for the Army to train to deal with domestic unrest. Of course, it's passed off in the media, oh, there's a mosque. Well, yeah, there was a mosque. There was also a Christian church. So it's multifaceted. Yes, it's for foreign occupation, but it's also for domestic preparation, because we know that Fort Hood soldiers and others are being trained that Christians, Tea Party supporters, anti-abortion activists are a radical terror threat. We've had those articles in the past. Department of Homeland Security, of course, in its own funded document, describes liberty lovers, that's their quote, liberty lovers, as domestic extremists, links them alongside terrorists. So you have a federal government in the United States that's increasingly paranoid about its own citizens, which is why they can unite the country around an external threat, which again benefits the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, we tried to get them to talk to us at the Asymmetric Warfare Center there in Virginia, where they built that city. Paul, it was originally going to be like $60 million, and they went 50% over budget on that. But we wanted to ask them some questions about that. I wanted to see if they really did have a mosque. Did you ever see a picture of a mosque there? Because all I saw was the footage that they put out. We used that in our report, but all I saw was a small-town Christian church. Did you see any other pictures that actually showed a mosque, or did they say that they had a mosque other than the article that the Telegraph had?
No, I actually saw the picture of the mosque with the minaret, but they also had, as you said, a Christian church. So yeah. We're all being targeted, whether it's Muslims in the Middle East or Americans at home. I don't think you find many small Christian churches like that in a lot of Muslim countries. So, it's targeting all of us.
Oh, well, it's clearly an American city. They had handicap parking signs. They had speed limit signs. They had a subway there with the logo from the Washington, D.C. subway. I mean, everything was very, very detailed. I found another video where they were actually laying down the slab when they were into the construction process, and it actually showed them stubbing up electrical and plumbing. I mean, these are not shells of buildings like they have trained with in the past. This is something where they are training. They see us as the insurgents.
The globalist social engineers are not just targeting us with propaganda. They are manipulating our genetics. We are being targeted at every level by estrogen mimickers that lower our testosterone and other hormones and natural compounds that the body needs. After consulting top doctors, nutritionists, pharmacists, and others, we have developed what I believe is the ultimate non-GMO organic super male vitality formula sourced from powerful organic herbs and then concentrated for maximum potency. Super Male Vitality was developed to activate your body's own natural processes instead of using synthetic chemicals. Super Male Vitality by InfoWars Life is so powerful that I only take half the recommended dose. For a limited time, we are offering 15% off Super Male Vitality at InfoWarsLife.com to introduce you to this powerful supplement. Visit InfoWarsLife.com today to secure your Super Male Vitality. InfoWarsLife.com.
Paul Joseph Watson, one of our esteemed writers and commentators. He's in the UK, and we've been talking about the IMF and the international bankers making their move, as they've been telegraphing for quite some time. Now it's become very obvious. They've actually put a price tag on it. $35 million. That's the price of the freedom of the Ukrainian people. They're going to loot them and rob them 5 different ways, as they've always done everybody when they come in and take over. But now, Paul, I wanted to talk to you about this law that just passed. We covered this when it came out a year ago, practically in April last year. They were putting forth a bill in Scotland called the Children and Young People's Bill. And, of course, this is going to, this now passed just within the last week, and it is going to assign a government guardian to every child in Scotland from birth until 18 years old. That's amazing. I mean, there's a lot of reaction from that, from the Christian community there, from people who understand the purpose of the family and who are concerned about government intrusions in the family. What's your take on this, Paul?
Well, David, I mean, this is chilling cradle-to-grave tyranny.
Yes.
Imagine if they uncovered an Obamacare regulation which said, oh, by the way, the government has a minder assigned to every child in the United States up to the age of 18. There would be an outcry. Yet this bill has passed, largely unopposed in Scotland. Every child, the NHS will appoint a health worker to act as a named person, a guardian for every child up until the age of 5. Then it passes over to the local government council they will assign individuals to monitor every single child in Scotland to, quote, ensure any potential cases of abuse or developmental difficulties are spotted and acted upon. What does that mean? Well, in the UK, just as in the US with the CPS, they steal children to meet quotas. In the case of the UK, it's adoption quotas. We've had a case just in the past week where a 4-year-old boy was torn from a loving middle-class family simply to meet an adoption quota. We've had cases in Colchester, Essex recently, where a family had 7 children. They attempted to have another baby. They had the baby. It was taken away from them by the government because the government said their family was too large. We've had children taken away from families because they're, quote, too fat. Wow. And then we've had babies removed for apparently no reason whatsoever. So this is about making it easier for the state to steal people's children. And then you connect it to other articles like last year, I believe it was, or a couple of years ago, there was a family in northern England, not far from where I used to live in Rotherham. They were members of the UK Independence Party. The parents were the foster parents, which is a major party expected to win the European parliamentary elections. Mm-hmm. The local council removed their 2 foster children because they were members of that political party, because according to the council, the party is, quote, racist because it opposes mass uncontrolled immigration. And despite the fact that these foster parents had a fantastic track record, loving parents with numerous different children, numerous different backgrounds and ethnicities, they took the children away because they were members of a political party, a mainstream political party that opposes immigration. So
I've got on the phone Paul Joseph Watson from the UK, and we were just talking about this outrageous bill that was passed by the Scottish legislature that is going to assign a government minder to every child from birth until the age of 18. And Paul was just recounting how they've had situations in the UK where children were taken from a family because in the judgment of the government they had too many children. How they were taken from a family because of their political affiliation. Of course, it was a mainstream political party. It wasn't the top 2 biggest parties, but it's a party that is coming up, the UK Independence Party. And I was just starting to talk about this case here in Boston, in Massachusetts, where a Connecticut family was seeking help for their daughter. You have 2 different hospitals, one of them Tufts, the other one Boston's Children's Hospital. Tufts says it's a physical problem. Boston Children's Hospital says it's a mental problem. The parents should be able to choose between those 2 conflicting diagnoses, but instead, the child was removed from their custody by the government, and they had a gag order put on them by the judge. And when the father went to Glenn Beck and talked about it on Glenn Beck's program, he was slammed with a contempt of court charge, and then the mother just passed out recently as they've taken the children away from them and put them in foster care. This is where this is headed, isn't it, Paul?
It's chilling, David. I mean, the amount of emails I receive on a weekly basis, both to my private email and to InfoWars, from people merely expressing grief, shock, and horror in 5-page emails recounting the whole horror story about how the state has stolen their children, begging me to draw attention to it. And I can't even get through most of them because it's just so fundamentally disturbing. There's actually a program in the UK called the Family Intervention Project, where the government installed surveillance cameras inside poor people's homes. I believe it was 20,000 different families had this done to them, to ensure that children went to bed on time, ate proper meals, and attended school. So that's the level of invasiveness. Now it comes out that GCHQ, British spy agency working with the NSA, is, as we predicted years ago, watching our webcams, storing the images from them. It's completely invasive nanny state. And again, how much will people put up with? Well, they'll put up with a lot. But once it comes to their wallets, that's maybe when it breaks.
Maybe when it comes to their children is when it breaks. They have maintained the document, the notion here In the U.S., the legal term for it is in loco parentis, which means in place of the parents. And courts have held over and over again that once you take your child to a government school, you'd have no right to complain about what they do in the school because you've essentially abandoned your child to the state in their eyes. The whole notion behind this publicly is that the government knows better and cares more for these children than the parents do. And of course, that is an absurd thing on the face of it that we ought to reject. But we need to understand that it is something far more sinister than that. This is something that attacks the very fundamental, the most fundamental institution in our society is the family. And that was why Plato wanted to remove it so he could have a strong government. That's what he suggested in the Republic, that no one in an ideal republic, according to Plato, would even know who their parents were. Their total allegiance would be to the state. And that's what we see the social engineers, the socialists of every stripe throughout generations have always sought to impose on a population. They've always seen the family as well as God as their competition.
Exactly. It's a Brave New World scenario. And of course, statistically, children are more likely to be abused when they're in, quote, government care per capita than in the general population. So their justification of protecting children is in fact the opposite. They're more likely to be abused in government care.
You are watching the best of the Alex Jones Show, weekdays from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. Central. Watch live at Infowars.com/show or become a member of InfoWarsNews.com and help us take resistance to the next level.